everyone. I'm the Executive Director of AMI-Quebec, and I'm happy to welcome you to our event tonight. Tonight we are marking the 30th anniversary of the Low Beer Memorial Lecture. This lecture was created back in 1994 as a way to raise awareness and understanding of mental health and illness-related issues. It was established in memory of John Hans Lowbeer in recognition of his family's friendship with AMI-Quebec and became the Edith and John Hans Lowbeer Lecture in 2010 after Edith passed away. The Department of Psychology of Concordia University and the Center for Clinical Research in Health have collaborated with AMI-Quebec on this annual event, and we are grateful for their ongoing interest and support. I assume that most of you are familiar with AMI-Quebec, so I shall not tire you with more information, except of encouraging you to visit our website often and find out what programs may be of interest to you. I wish to recognize that we are gathering today on unceded Indigenous territory, on lands with a rich history of occupation and stewardship by Indigenous people of millennia through to the present day. In acknowledging where we are gathering today, I hope we are all reminded of our relationality to land and between people, communities, and systems. This relationality and the care it necessitates is the heart of what we are here to discuss tonight. I cannot move on without acknowledging my deepest pain about the many wars, armed conflicts, and mass violence in the world right now. I wish we can recognize that hatred, revenge, and retaliation can offer, at best, a momentary relief from pain. But respect, compassion, and love can sustain our humanity. Tonight, we have chosen to address the complex issue of medical assistance in dying from mental illness. As you may know, in June 2016, the Parliament of Canada passed federal legislation that allows eligible Canadian adults to request medical assistance in dying. Once reserved for people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable, in 2021, the law was expanded to those not at imminent risk of dying, but whose illness, disability, or disease is causing enduring suffering that is intolerable to them. In December 2022, the Government of Canada announced its intention to introduce legislation to seek an extension of the temporary exclusion of eligibility for persons suffering solely from mental illness. And in February 2023, it introduced legislation to further extend that temporary exclusion for a period of 1 year until March 2024. Discussing MAiD for mental illness now, therefore, is timely. It is a multifaceted subject fraught with controversies and high emotions. Our goal tonight is to address the different perspectives and many nuances, and we hope you will be better informed and come away with a better understanding, not necessarily with a clear opinion. We have a panel of 4, including 2 psychiatrists and 2 persons with lived experience of mental illness. The discussion will be moderated by Nantali Ndongo. If you have questions, you are invited to send them throughout the evening, and our team will sort them out and pass them on to Nantali. Nantali Ndongo is the host producer of The Bridge on CBC Quebec Radio 1. The 1-hour program profiles the dreamers shaping arts and culture, delving into personal stories and hot topics in the milieu with guest-curated selection of music. Nantali started her career at CBC Quebec in 2010 as a writer, broadcaster, and researcher with all of the current affairs programs, eventually becoming a radio producer. Nantali produced the award-winning series Real Talk on Race, as well as internal 5-episode podcast series about inclusive work in journalism. In addition to working as the multi-platform arts and culture contributor for CBC Montreal, Nantali was a contributor to Radio Canada's culture programs as well. Born and raised in Montreal, Nantali holds a degree in English literature from the University of Ottawa with a minor in communication and a postgraduate certificate from Humber Schools of Journalism. Nantali and the panel, please.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. All right. We will begin first and foremost by just presenting our panelists this evening. So I'm going to start with, all the way to my far right, Dr. Derek Smith. Graduated in medicine at the University of Western Ontario and completed training and certification in psychiatry at the University of British Columbia in 1985. He's a past president of the British Columbia Medical Association and of the Medical Legal Society. Currently, Dr. Smith conducts independent medical examinations for the courts with recognized expertise in the area of psychiatry and traumatic brain injury. Dr. Smith is a clinical professor emeritus with the Department of Psychiatry. He has been active in medical assistance in dying since the Carter case, in which he testified as an expert. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us. And then we have Dr. Sonu Gand, is a professor and governor at the University of Toronto and chief of psychiatry at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center with clinical expertise as a psycho-oncology consultant. Dr. Gand has been actively involved in health policy development and advocacy since residency and has been recognized with numerous regional, provincial, national, and international awards for his teaching, advocacy, and impact. He has helped form health policy and engaged medical colleagues and the public to be more aware of and advocate against policies that stigmatize and discriminate against the mentally ill. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gand. We also have with us Chris Somerville. Chris Somerville has been involved as a national and international leader in the schizophrenia recovery movement for over 30 years. He has served as a board member of the Mental Health Commission of Canada and has served as the CEO of the Schizophrenia Society of Canada since 2007. As a family member and a person with individual lived experience, he is an avid advocate for recovery-oriented mental health services and peer support. Thanks for joining us, Chris Somerville. And just to my right, we did a quick edit of your bio before because there was a lot of information to share. But Al Raimundo asked for me to say that for the past 10 years, Al has been co-designing awesome mental health apps, programs, and policies. Al is a thought leader for their work with over 1,000 speeches worldwide, including the United Nations World Youth Day, TEDx, and Canada's Senate and federal government. Thank you for joining us, Al. So we outlined at the beginning just an overview of the dates of the changes to the legislation around medical assistance in dying. And I'd like to start with Dr. Smith and Dr. Gand. Clearly, it has evolved since 2016, and we've gone from this is permitted to someone with imminent death to now passing, possibly in March 2024, allowing this legislation to move forward for people with mental illness. Can you outline, Dr. Gand, why we got here?
Sure, and thank you for the question, because I think it is important that people have a sense of the background. I also should put my cards on the table, because I think in these kinds of policy discussions, disclosure is important. And my disclosure is I'm not what they call a conscientious objector. I actually do support MAiD as it was first brought in 2016. At the same time, with the expansion that has been happening, I've become increasingly concerned. And I formerly chaired my hospital's MAiD team in my former hospital. And I no longer work on the MAiD team because of the expansions, actually. But in terms of how we got here, I think it's probably fair to say we may have some differences of opinion about how we got here. But there was a Supreme Court case in 2015, the Carter case, that involved two plaintiffs, spinal stenosis and ALS, I believe it was, but again, no mental illness. The outcome of that case was that the Supreme Court ruled that the blanket prohibition, meaning the absolute prohibition against helping people die in some circumstances, breached our charter. Won't get into the reasons for all of that, but they said that in some circumstances, assisted dying or assisted suicide should be permissible to adults. The circumstances, they said, included if, the law that came in as a result included a safeguard which we no longer have. And this is what's actually led to our expansion. That in 2016, the initial law that came in included a safeguard that the person's natural death needed to be reasonably foreseeable. And I think that that's actually the situation most Canadians think MAiD is typically for. That's certainly why I got into the area. And under that old regime, even if people had up to about 10 years of life left to live, they could get MAiD. You did not need to be at death's door. So it already was quite open in that sense. There was then a case in Quebec, the Truchon case in 2019, in which a single judge ruled that the reasonably foreseeable natural death safeguard was overly restrictive. The government did not appeal that ruling, and the government chose also not to get what's called a referral to the Supreme Court. Instead, they altered the national laws, even though a provincial ruling would not actually have bearing on other provinces, but they altered the laws to remove the reasonably foreseeable safeguard, and this is why we get into the expansion issue and the mental illness issue, because mental illness on its own does typically not lead to reasonably foreseeable natural death.
Dr. Smith, in terms of how you've witnessed the evolution of this law, is there something that Dr. Gann missed or something that we should remember?
Well, like my friend and colleague, Dr. Gain, I should declare my conflict, and I'm an advocate for MAiD and an advocate for MAiD for people with mental illness, providing that they qualify and meet all the criteria. So I don't have any difference of opinion with the history that Dr. Gain gave you, but there are a few caveats. Of some interest is the fact that Kay Carter, the initial plaintiff in the case in British Columbia, was actually dead at the time of the case. She had assisted dying in Switzerland before the case ever got to the court. I was an expert witness in that case, so I know it well. After the Supreme Court decided 9-0 in favor of changing the criminal code and granting assisted dying to people who met criteria, you had to apply to the courts to have MAiD. And during that period of time, there was a case in Alberta, a woman named EF who had a single psychiatric diagnosis. The judge heard the case and granted her assisted dying. The government of Canada appealed this to the Alberta Supreme Court, and they lost the case. So this woman, EF, before we had legislation, was granted an assisted death using just the rules that flowed out of the Carter case. So what we're talking about today is not expanding MAiD to include people with mental illness. It's restoring a charter right to these people. When the government finally came in with legislation that Dr. Yang referred to, C-14, they inserted the clause, natural death must be reasonably foreseeable, that was not part of the Carter decision. And the result of putting that clause in meant that people who were disabled or people who had mental illness whose death was not going to be coming around very shortly were compelled to continue suffering, and they were not eligible for MAiD. And as Dr. Gaines said as well, this was overturned in Quebec. The case, Jean Turchant was a totally disabled man in a wheelchair, and the judge ruled that he did not have to suffer any longer, even though his natural death was not reasonably foreseeable. He qualified for MAiD, and she granted MAiD and directed the government to change the law, which they did with C7. So that's where we are now. There's been a big political backlash around this. It's become big P politics at the highest level in Canada. There's a huge controversy over this. The psychiatry community is divided on our view of whether we should go ahead with this, but I think that's where we're having the discussion tonight.
Exactly, but I did want to just jump in there about, there's a huge divide. You point to political divide, but do you get a sense that there's also a societal divide with regards to this question?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so great to be talking to members of the public, citizens and patients about this, because this legislation is not about doctors or nurses or hospitals. It's about Canadians who are suffering from illnesses. So there is no doubt the controversy about this. Looking at the bigger picture, Canadians are increasingly taking advantage of this law. The latest statistics that were published last month in October, showed that 13,000 Canadians had an assisted death, and that's up from 10,000 the year before. So increasingly Canadians are opting for this. We have not had any cases of people with psychiatric illness yet because it's been illegal, and we won't know how that's going to roll out until March of 2024.
But what we don't understand from those numbers that we'll try to unpack in this conversation is why people are taking advantage of it. Is it just exclusively about the mental illness, or are there other factors that are exacerbating how they're living with mental illness? So Al, I wanted to get a sense from you. Do you think that MAiD should be a person living with mental illness should be eligible to receive MAiD?
I do believe that somebody living with a mental illness should be eligible to receive MAiD, much like the doctor said, if they've met all the criteria that will be put in place. I come at this in a very unique perspective as somebody who has lost somebody to MAiD due to mental illness. And I've also lost folks in my life to suicide, and the difference between those two losses is immeasurable. With MAiD, you get to say goodbye. You get the trauma, like the person gets to die with dignity, and the trauma that is imparted on the people around them is much less because everybody, they know what's coming. The thing we've also known with the mental health community for folks who are really suffering and seeing nothing better is that folks have been organizing their own version of MAiD for quite some time, but when it's not done officially, there is issues that appear, and they don't necessarily die with dignity, and it is very difficult. As somebody who is not only a person with lived experience, but is also a cancer survivor, I can tell you that the pain of untreated mental illness and the pain created by cancer was so similar to me, and it felt, and if I was sitting in either of those experiences with nothing getting better, with trying all of the treatments available to me, medications available to me, I can understand why people get exhausted.
Let's just sit with that point for a second, because I think it would be very challenging for people to make the comparison between physical pain that we associate with something like cancer and then what you just described as pain from mental illness. How are they similar?
It's similar in terms of it's all encompassing. It affects everything you do, the amount of energy it takes just to get out of bed in the morning, the amount of never feeling rested, never feeling okay, unable to do the things you want to do in your life, and just it every day. For both of those healthcare experiences I've had, it felt like waking up with a 100-pound backpack on my back, and the next day it was 105 pounds.
And we should put into context that you have been living with mental illness since very early on in life, even from your teenage years. So yeah, continue.
And I'm lucky that I'm somebody whose mental health treatments have worked really well from, and I found happiness and recovery. And that's part of the reason I believe that there needs to be systems in place for folks to make sure that they have access to treatment, that folks are not choosing MAiD because they live in a community where there is no access to healthcare or treatment. And it's also really important to me that if MAiD gets brought up, it's the person's bringing it up. It's not the doctors or the community around them that's bringing it up because they can't care for them. I have seen people with mental health issues who will not give up, and they're having a bad time, nothing's working, but they will not give up. But I also can't fault folks for trying for years and decades and nothing working and just getting exhausted.
Before, Chris, I have a question for you, but I think we should also establish what are we calling mental illness when we're talking about MAiD and mental illness? We aren't necessarily talking about someone living with depression for a few days or feeling blue for a few days. This is about ongoing, long-standing challenges with mental health. Dr. Gann.
So actually, I think this is one of the misconceptions about where our laws are headed, because in fact it's not. If I am blunt, I would say as a society, have been given false reassurances about who would actually be able to get MAiD for sole mental illness. We typically do get reassurances that it'll be people who've struggled for many years, tried many things, etc. However, the reality is that our law does not require that. We have literally zero safeguards that require that. We were the first country in the world that actually did not require that people needed to be at a point of, in the European countries, they call it treatment futility, and have tried various treatments. Here, people can actually get MAiD without having tried or having had access to treatment. And I think that's an important point, because with mental illness, it often brings about a sense of despair that nothing will help. And so I think people must keep in mind that reassurances are not safeguards, and we literally have no safeguards.
And we've recently had some reports that have pointed to some of the data with regards to people applying for and successfully using MAiD, where we've seen that the numbers show that many of them were elderly people who it wasn't necessarily clear that they definitely required this choice at that moment in their life. Chris Somerville, mental illness it's not just a part of your professional work, it is also part of your personal story. And I wonder, what is the message to people living with mental illness after March 2024?
Well, I'm still going to speak and preach, which I used to be a pastor, and now I've incriminated myself for somebody with a Southern accent, with the only hook in the audience. And you're going to think I'm a redneck compared to these gentlemen and ladies around me. I'm not an advocate of MAiD, not because I'm from Alabama, not because I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm still going to give the message of hope. I have been a strong proponent of recovery philosophy, that people can come to a place, even with symptoms of mental illness, of being able to live a life of meaning and hope and social inclusion. Now, why doesn't that take place? That doesn't take place because we as a society do not socially include people. Now, depression. I have struggled with suicidal depression many times in my life. And let me tell you what depression is. Harvey Chochinov, you know Dr. Chochinov in Winnipeg? That's where I live now. in the center of Canada, not in Alabama. And I'm better off for it. Amen? Praise the Lord. So we're going to liven up this group here a little bit, okay? So Dr. Choffenoff wrote an article in the Winnipeg Free Press a couple of months ago. Depression is a great liar. And if you struggle with depression, you know that. It says you will not get better. There's no hope. It'll get worse. Depression is a great liar. And now let me say with all compassion, you know, any of my friends or relatives that would choose MAiD, even though I'm not an advocate for it, I'd still pray with them and be kind, and I wouldn't be, you know, articulating the way I am right now. I mean, people do make choices, but you know, we live in a postmodern world. When I was born in 1952, we lived in modernism. There were absolutes. Today, there are no absolutes. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth, and they can contradict each other. So we live in that. So here we are. What does it matter what the Supreme Court says? I mean, Supreme Court of the United States once ruled that slavery was okay. So we don't live in a period in terms of absolutes. Did you know this? I'm going to give you a statistic that I'm reading off of my iPhone right now. Prioritize mental health, not MAiD, say Canadians. 82% of Canadians say no to expanded euthanasia without first improving mental health access. You say, euthanasia, Chris? Well, let me just tell you something. MAiD is a euphemism for suicide. Euthanasia, suicide, and MAiD are the same. I want to get out. I want my pain to stop. I can't stand this hell. And I've been there to some degree. My father took his life by suicide. My brother did too. Why did my father take his life by suicide? He had no hope, and he was in a living hell for all the guilt and other things that the trauma he gave to the family. So, you know, I just want to cut straight to, you know, the point that, you know, we dress it up and we call it MAiD, you know, with a little apron and a little hat on, and go down to the south in Jackson, Mississippi, and be the MAiD. No, it's suicide, I think. And I don't mean to be mean by any of that, but I think it's startling when 82% of Canadians say, let's expand mental health services as opposed to MAiD. Let me tell you this. If we were just talking about mental health services tonight, just mental health services, we'd all of us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, did I get that right? Yeah, 5. We'd all say that our mental health services are horrible in Canada.
We are going to get to that question.
So why don't we fix the mental health system, damn it,
we're going
before
to
we
get
get
to that.
MAiD?
We're going to get to that. But I want to ask Dr. Smith, it kind of, Chris Somerville just pointed to something that I think is the opposite of what you argue, or the testimony that you gave, at least in May 2022, to the Special Joint Committee on Mental Assistance in Dying at the House of Commons. And in many parts of your testimony, you pointed to ultimately that it is up to the patient. And in fact, what you say, at one point, you say, you have to understand the nature of the human experience of the person who's sitting in front of you. And later on, you also talk about, you say, I quote, the law is quite clear. The patient must agree in terms of treatment. And if they don't agree, then the person has an irremediable condition. So your position is that this comes down to what a person wants for themselves.
Yes, the law has been changed to empower each of you in the audience to make a request for MAiD if you satisfy the criteria. You may or may not want MAiD. You may continue to want to suffer with your illness. There is no one forcing anyone to do this. It really does not make any difference what your friends or neighbors think or what your doctors think. This is an initiative that puts power in the hands of the individual person to make this very personal and difficult decision by themselves in consultation with their doctor. So Chris has mentioned it'd be nice to improve mental health services. Well, everyone is in agreement with that, but it's not just mental health services. Our healthcare system is falling apart. In the province where Al and I live, 10% of the patients don't have a family doctor. In Ontario, it's estimated that 25% of the population will not have a family doctor in 4 years. So it would be great if we could fix the healthcare system, but that doesn't help the suffering of the individual person. So this is up to each of you or each of your relatives to decide. You have to make a request. It's not mandatory. You don't have to do this. Many people will choose not to. In fact, some people have been approved for MAiD and at the last minute decide to change their mind, because why people do change their mind. So this is a piece of legislation that empowers individuals to make a request to their doctor when they're having suffering that is intolerable for them.
I have many questions that are flowing in so many directions, but I want to also make sure that we get a real sense of everyone's experience and knowledge here. Dr. Gan, as we mentioned, you've been involved with policy and MAiD since 2015, but you also now just said that you've walked away from chairing the team at your hospital. You went so far as to publish a poem on your website called Last Rites, Ode to C7, basically a tongue-in-cheek kind of poem about what we're talking about right now, from the perspective of someone who has mental illness and has been granted permission to go through with MAiD. What motivates you? I mean, you, even as you're speaking, you're very emotional about this legislation. You seem very concerned about March 2024.
Oh, I'm very concerned. The poem you reference, I actually wrote that on the night that our Bill C7 legislation passed in 2021, when Parliament passed it after a 3-hour debate. That was the extent of the debate, by the way, that led to what we call the sunset clause, which has now foretold that we will expand MAiD for mental illness. That's how it was framed. It wasn't a discussion about should we, is it safe to do, do we know what we're doing? It was a political decision after a 3-hour debate in Parliament. That night I wrote that poem, and I was incredibly sad as a Canadian that night writing it, because while I support MAiD in general, and I think what most surveys show is that most Canadians do support MAiD for certain conditions, I support it to help somebody avoid a painful death. I do not support it to help somebody escape a painful life of social suffering and poverty. And when we expand it to mental illness, that's actually the track that we're going towards, because, and this is how we get there, because what we will be doing is when we provide, if and when we provide it for sole mental illness, we will be providing death to non-dying people under false pretenses. This is serious business. This is serious business, that we have said that our MAiD laws are meant, and this is what all of us in the room think, and what we should think, is that our MAiD laws are meant when there's a medical condition that is what is called irremediable, meaning one that will not get better, meaning one that we can predict will not get better. And the reality is that I know many of my colleagues think they can make those predictions. I also know that all of the evidence shows that they are wrong. I sat on the CCA expert panel. We looked at this for a year and a half. There is ample evidence that shows our best guesses at predicting when a mental illness in any person will not improve are no better than flipping a coin.
But however, what do you say to the person who is in front of you, who says, this has been years ongoing, that I'm feeling, as Al described, pain, that I have tried several forms of treatment, and yet I still am not feeling any better, and also my quality of life is disintegrating as a result?
So I think what we say is we don't abandon them. We stay with them. We don't abandon them. And frankly, in my opinion, what we're doing with MAiD for sole mental illness is abandoning them, because what we're then saying is, oh yes, I come in with my white lab coat and I tell you that yes, I think your situation is irremediable, that it won't get better. And again, all the evidence shows that we're right less than 50% of the time. That means at least half of those people will have. And we will be telling people in their moments of despair that they won't get better. That will not actually be accurate. But based on that, they will think nothing will ever improve. It colludes with their depression and hopelessness. And the other piece, as Chris mentioned, the issue of suicidality. What we know from the few countries that have allowed this in Europe is that when people apply for MAiD for sole mental illness, there's overlap between the group that is applying for that and those who are suicidal from their mental illness and who actually would benefit from suicide prevention. So we're then telling people, many of whom would get better, that they won't. We will not be able to separate suicidality from that, contrary to what we've been reassured. The evidence shows we can't. And we also know the saddest piece, which is that people with mental illness also struggle a lot more with social despair and social poverty and social disenfranchisement, which in Canada is already fueling some of the MAiD requests people have gotten.
Al, you shrugged at one point. I sense that you disagree with part of what Dr. Ganges expressed.
I unfortunately have lost a lot of friends to suicide. And one of the things that was the threads in a lot of those conversations, the last unfortunate conversations I've had with them, was feeling abandoned by doctors already because they kept asking them to keep trying, not acknowledging nothing was working. And the pain, and it felt like folks were keeping them, a lot of them, and I've even felt this myself when things were not working. It felt like I was being kept here as an experiment, as a thing that nobody could promise me a quality of life. And I think, like, some of those, like, some folks who may apply may get better, like was mentioned, that some folks decide to not take it if they get it, and not everybody who applies gets it. But it's very hard to have years in my life where I went to more funerals and birthday parties, and then folks just asking us to stay without being able to give us a guarantee that it will get better, because, well, we're wrong 50% of the time. There's another half of that number that was right. And I think it's very difficult to keep asking folks to show up who are exhausted, who have tried a lot of things, who every day is more hurtful than the last one, and feeling like that pain is being discounted and nobody is helping them.
Chris?
Well, I was in a psychiatric institution 4 years ago, just before the pandemic. It was horrible. I'm going to have aortic valve replacement next month. And my team of cardiologists, they treat me far better than the mental health team did in the psychiatric institution. You're seen as an illness. You're not seen for your strengths, your contributions. And that's the era of the mental health system in terms of how we've made it, and, in tests and asking the same questions over again, and not asking a person about their hopes and dreams and future and a hopeful one. So I've made a distinction between mental health services and cardiological services. One of the qualifications for MAiD, and correct me, gentlemen, you know more about this than I do, is it has to be irremediable. The disease, the illness. Well, I don't believe, along with a minority of psychiatrists who would agree with me, that it's irremediable. In other words, I'm not saying it's easy. I know that personally. But it doesn't have to lead to death, mental illness. And, we live in a very lonely society. Pay attention to what I'm going to say right now. You're going to be reading more and more about how loneliness is epidemic in our society. Who wants to die alone? Who wants to have pain and suffering alone? What would we say to Job? Job, the book of Job. Well, Job, just take MAiD. Curse God and take MAiD. That's what his wife said, so as not to be hard on her. I think she was more or less just giving him that option. Would we say to Jesus Christ, my Savior, take MAiD, don't go to the cross? Is there any value in suffering? And I'm not saying this is easy. There's been times when I myself have said, I wished I could just die. But then my faith comes forth, and hope comes forth, and love comes forth. And, we live in a society today that if I was a teenager, I would probably feel like a rimless bubble on the sea of nothingness compared to the values that are being shared today. I'm going to just quote something here just for a second, if I can and find it, in terms of expanding the health services. There is a worry within the disability community, and I know that the gentleman here on my far right, we talked about the slippery slope concept, and I don't want to use that word tonight, but, people saying, one person who applied for MAiD, the real reason was because they couldn't find housing. So are people going to be choosing MAiD without telling anybody else that the reason they're choosing MAiD is they feel so hopeless and alone and abandoned, no house, no income, they live in poverty, and so, hey, let's just check out of life. And we as a loving, caring society, and it will take a society to provide the things and the values that I'm talking about. Right. I'm not talking about isolationism.
However, Chris, I worry about perhaps simplifying how the process will actually unfold. So, Dr. Smith, especially since you've been involved in some of the committees and offering testimony in the shaping of this legislation eventually, what would be some of the preliminary steps for MAiD for someone with mental illness?
Well, just before addressing that, I think we have to come back to the issue of irremediability, because that's one of the criteria that has to be met in legislation. There's two aspects to irremediability. Dr. Gain and I have a difference of opinion on this. His view is the evidence shows that mental illness is never irremediable. My evidence is that it is many times irremediable. I refer to the concept of treatment-resistant depression. The STAR-D trial, which was a very intensive study, showed that only after 4 drug trials, only 64% of people got better. And in a recent study published last month, they're trying out a new antidepressant called ketamine. Only a quarter of the people got better with that, which means that 3/4 didn't. So the majority of people with depression do not make a full and complete recovery. Now, the typical person who's probably going to be eligible for MAiD, and I base this on the statistics from the countries in the Benelux area where they already have MAiD for mental illness, is probably going to be someone who's over 50 years of age. They will have had depression for 20 or 30 years. They will have tried many medications. They probably have been hospitalized. They've tried psychotherapy. In spite of all of that, they are still suffering from depression. That is the kind of person who's likely to be eligible. And the numbers in Canada, I estimate to be about 25 people a year. Compare that to the 13,000 Canadians who are having MAiD for things like cancer and heart conditions. So we're talking here about a very small number of people who have suffered from mental illness for many, many years and are finally taking the decision that they don't want any more treatment. Now, that's the second part of irremediability, is that the person has to accept more treatment. And as soon as the person does not accept more treatment, they are by definition irremediable.
Before, I see you shaking your head, but I wanted to ask, what you pointed to were cases where it seems that the only treatment was around medication. What about other forms of treatment that are perhaps more holistic in approach?
Well, the people are offered all kinds of treatment for depression. Psychotherapy, medication, electroconvulsive therapy, many different treatment options are available, but how many of these do you have to have tried and failed before you say that's enough? I don't want any more treatment. I mean, this doesn't apply to mental illness. I mean, if you have pancreatic cancer, there's an operation that's very disfiguring called the Whipple. You may not want to have Whipple surgery. If you do not want Whipple surgery, your cancer is therefore irremediable. So this is not a concept that's just unique to psychiatry. It's a concept for all of medicine. And the person who decides on irremediability, mostly the person who is requesting MAiD.
Dr. Gann?
So, with respect, I have to say that I disagree with almost everything that Dr. Smith just said. Actually, well, not almost. Actually, I disagree with everything. I disagree with everything Dr. Smith just said. And I'll start with this, that, the comparison to the European countries is not valid. As I mentioned, in the European countries, they have a requirement that people have gone through treatment, that people are at a point of treatment futility. Here, policymakers have refused to put that in. It is not a safeguard in the law, and quite literally, we have had people who are assessors acknowledge. Well, so we can talk about that in a second, but I've got to address some of these issues because it is not at all the picture Dr. Smith paints. That in terms of the safeguards, they are not there to ensure that this is the sort of person who gets MAiD. You know, we're living in a country where less than 1 in 3 adults who have mental health needs get the treatment or help or care they need for adolescents, and they are talking about expanding MAiD to children with no lower age limit. That's in the discussions, at least. With children for mental illness needs, less than 1 in 4 get it. And we have had prominent assessors say that if somebody's even on a wait list long enough to get care that could help, they would qualify that person for MAiD. So it is not the picture Dr. Smith paints. And in terms of irremediability, the question is not whether people always get better. That is not the question. The question is whether we can predict when they won't. And as you know, the statistics clearly show that we cannot. In fact, even with things called precision modeling, we are right 47% of the time. That's worse than flipping a coin. You have better odds at being right flipping a coin. So again, we will be lying to half the people that we say you have an irremediable mental condition. The other thing is, it's not just about treatment. You know, I work in psycho-oncology. That's my clinical background, working in psychiatry and the field of cancer. And there is absolutely no comparison between the predictability of whether a condition will or will not get better when it's a mental illness. So Dr. Smith talked about treatment. Let's talk about even if you don't have treatment. If you don't have treatment, naturalistic studies of depression, meaning no treatment, show that if you go out 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, an increasing number of people get better even without treatment, and it's over 50 to 60%. Studies show around 60 to 70% by the time you're out 12 months with no treatment. And do you know what the numbers are with cancer? No one does. Why? Because it almost never happens. Once you have a cancer that is symptomatic, without treatment, if it's causing severe symptoms without treatment, it's estimated it might be 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million that get better spontaneously. We're talking about totally different things with mental illness. And we're going to be pretending to people frankly, in our hubris to think that we know someone won't get better when science tells us we can't make that prediction. We're going to be complicit with their despair and tell them they won't.
Let's make it more complicated. I'm 71 and I'm not the oldest, eh? I'm going to make this complicated. We do not know what causes mental illness. Now, the psychiatrists and the doctors behind closed doors, I'll say, well, you said the word hypothesis up there on the stage. What are we really talking about? A theory. Chemical imbalance, dopamine, serotonin, those are the strongest theories we have about what causes certain mental illnesses. And so this discussion is somewhat presuppositional, meaning we all have presuppositions, assume concepts of ideas or truth that we believe we bring to the discussion. So the presupposition is the biomedical model. I don't subscribe. If I could not work in the schizophrenia movement and subscribe totally and wholly to the biochemical model. I mean, we're psychosocial, spiritual, communal, biological individuals. And so cures or remedies for mental illness are very person-centered, holistic. And, you know, one of the difficulties with MAiD in terms of mental illness is it's built on the construct of exclusively a biomedical model. And there are people who can take medications for years, and that's not the solution. It may be unresolved trauma, unresolved guilt, et cetera, et cetera. And again, these are not easy conversations we're having tonight. And again, I want to say, lest anyone think that I'm just a wolf in sheep's clothing. I would give all the love and care I could to anybody who has the right in our Canadian society for MAiD. Just because you have the right doesn't mean it's the thing that the Lord would want us to do. It's the way we govern society.
However, in our Charter of Rights and Freedom, religion is is based on the individual. So we're not going to necessarily turn to religious.
Let me tell you this one right now, real quick, because I'm Mr. Recovery, some people call me Mr. Recovery in terms of mental illness. Not cure, but living beyond mental illness symptoms with a sense of meaning and purpose and hope and social inclusion. We're hard pressed to talk about spirituality. It's okay for indigenous people. We stand up and we applaud indigenous people. I'm not putting them down. But if somebody like me gets up and talks about spirituality, it's like, well, you're kind of redneckish, aren't you, Chris? Well, did you know what's the one of the top 10 factors for recovery in people with mental illness? They themselves, the recovery literature about people who get better. Do you know one of the top 10 factors for their saying, attributing their recovery to, sorry about my English, is spirituality. A sense of connection with a higher power. Now, I think I know who the highest power is, JC. But, that sense of connection and spirituality gives you hope and love towards people. So, you have to look at all the other studies.
Al, I wanted to get your take on the challenge that we seem to often have with the idea that people still do have the right to choose how they want to live and when they perhaps want to die. Why do we have this challenge, do you think?
I think part of it is, and I think maybe this is one of the things that everybody on the panel would agree, is I'm definitely the oldest. No, I'm kidding. Is that I don't think anybody wants anybody to die. I think in the lived experience community, we are all connected to each other, and we don't if I could snap my fingers right now and make it so that they would all have a really good life and that nobody would be thinking about suicide or in this position, I would do it. But I'm also struck with the reality of the situation. Most of the funerals due to suicide I've been to in my life are not folks who weren't intimately familiar with the mental health system. They're other people like me. There are other very well-known advocates who have fought, who have been asking for a better mental health system, and they've been fighting day in and day out to create the system that they want to use. And and they've made great progress. And I'm hoping for one day we can be in a place where there is no suicide, where we have something that works every time someone's experiencing thoughts of suicide. The ever-growing amount of funeral pamphlets on my fridge say that we're not there. And if we are in a place where we can't prevent people from dying by suicide, and at the end of the day, regardless of what MAiD passes or not, we can't stop people. If people are suffering and they're having a hard time and it's not getting better, that's something we've shown, whether we restrict their freedom or we do all these other things, we can't stop them. And so I came to this decision after seeing my friend pass away from MAiD in Europe, being for me, it's a harm reduction thing. I believe that every person who's feeling suicidal, we should fight for their life. We should give them options. We should make sure that they're there. But if we can't prevent all suicides, and today we're not, they deserve to die with dignity and they deserve to be able to say goodbye. And that's what MAiD gives people.
I want to get a sense of how much time we have left, but I'm trying to situate the person who's going to tell me that before we get to some questions. Yeah. Okay. We have indirectly been talking also about improvements to our healthcare system and particularly to our healthcare system for mental health. The understanding is this legislation is going to pass March 2024. If you have a mental illness that is irremediable, you can apply for MAiD. There will be, as there is now, steps to go through before you can be approved. You could also decide at some point to not go through with it. With that aside, what are some of the things that definitely need to happen with regards to mental health care in our society, actively happen as solutions to slow down, because we have been seeing a steady growth every year since 2016. You're nodding so it sounds like you have many ideas.
All members of this panel and probably all members of the audience would agree that our mental health services need a huge improvement. People are not getting the kinds of evidence-based treatment that they should get. Having said that, this is up to the government to change. The government overpromises and underdelivers on healthcare, as we all know. We're all living through healthcare that is second-rate in Canada right now. So why does the individual have to suffer if they can't get adequate health care? That should be up to the individual. In the meantime, all of us are putting our shoulders to the wheel to try to improve mental health services and health services in general. I'm pessimistic that we're going to make much headway on that, unfortunately.
Well, however, because as someone who has access to the government to a certain degree, who is invited to talk to the government at the House of Commons, etc., you have the opportunity, the privilege to suggest ideas around this question of MAiD for the mentally ill, but I would assume also other solutions. How much of the factors where intersectionality is involved, like race, like poverty, like gender, how much of those factors are weighed into the conversation around what will be the final language of this law for MAiD and people with mental illness?
I don't think those factors are addressed in the law at all, and there's probably a reason for that, and that is that this law applies to everybody, regardless of your gender, regardless of your sexual orientation, color, education, and so on. This has to do with what the individual Canadian wants to do nearing the end of their life, whether they have had enough suffering that they want that suffering relieved. So it doesn't make any difference who you are as an individual. In fact, if you look at the statistics, the people who are taking advantage of MAiD right now are people who are well educated. They have better than average income. They're mostly white people. You could argue that the disadvantaged in our society are grossly underrepresented in the people who are actually accessing MAiD.
Go ahead.
So just kind of getting back to the initial part of the question about what else would be needed to help people, because this is what you're asking, like what's needed to actually help people. It is not just about treatment. It is not just about medicalization and medical treatment. It is about helping people live with dignity. And in fact, that also crosses over to whether people want to live or die. You know, if you look at the recommendations from CDC in the States about a proper suicide prevention framework, one or two of the things might mention treatment of mental illness. All of the other things are make sure the person has stable housing, make sure that they have connections, relationships, that they're not living in poverty, that they're not, all of that. Now, how does that play out with our MAiD laws? And this is what concerns me.
So do we have those kinds of recommendations? Have we had those kinds of recommendations?
Not in this context. And in fact, I hope people are shocked to hear this. They should be. I was shocked when I read this, although I knew the law allows this. But to actually hear people say explicitly that yes, people can get MAiD for things like poverty. You know, the current president of CAMAP, which is the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, she was asked about this in a piece in Walrus, and she explicitly said that the suffering that actually fuels the request does not have to be suffering from the illness. Because she was being asked about people who have gotten it for poverty. Now, how does that intersect with what you were asking with mental illness, intersectionalities, and marginalization? Dr. Smith mentioned that people in Canada have tended to be better off, the ones who've taken MAiD so far. And when you look at MAiD for end-of-life conditions, that is true. When you look at MAiD for mental illness, it is not true. It's a different population, and in fact, we're already seeing signs of that.
But how can we see people with MAiD and mental illness if that part of the law has been suspended for a while now?
In the European countries that allow it. So in the European countries that allow it, it is actually not people who are better off that get it. Here, when people have their end of life that's foreseeable, as many men as women get it. In the European countries that allow MAiD for mental illness, there's a huge and terrifying gender gap. Twice as many women as men get MAiD for sole mental illness. I've not yet heard a single person adequately explain that. And to me, that's very concerning as a psychiatrist, because that is exactly the same ratio of the number of women to men who attempt suicide when they have mental illness. And most do not die by suicide, and most do not try again. Most people who attempt don't reattempt and don't actually die. So the question should be, are we converting that transient suicidality to permanent death through MAiD? And even that aside, we also see things like unresolved loneliness and poverty in those groups that get MAiD for mental illness in the European countries. And here, although we haven't had MAiD for sole mental illness, we have expanded it so that people can get it even if their deaths aren't foreseeable. And in the stats that came out last week, this should concern people. More than 1 in 3 people cited that feeling a burden to family and friends and society was part of what fueled their MAiD request. About 1 in 5 cited loneliness. Is this what we're providing death for?
Chris and Al, I'd love for you to weigh in on this. People living with a mental illness aren't necessarily in direct contact with a doctor, such as yourselves. Some might only have access to community services and clinics, and not psychiatrists or psychotherapists even. What would you expect or need from the people on the ground? We talk a lot about the increase here in Montreal, the increase of people living on the streets and suffering with mental illness, and their first contact is often the police. Now we've added social workers and these kinds of folks to work with them. What would you expect from people working on the ground who have often direct contact with people with mental illness to help them?
I think to answer this question, I want to paint a little bit of a picture. So I want to talk a little bit about what my experience was like reaching out for help and then getting help and what that journey looked like. So anytime you realize that you may be different than somebody else, self-stigma is a thing. And so you spend a lot of time battling with yourself, trying to decide if it's bad enough, trying to decide if it's worth asking for help. Is it just going to go away? It takes a lot, and it took me a long time to realize this is something that is bad, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And then it took me a lot of energy to get to that point. Then from that point, it took me a bunch of research and energy that was very sparring as my mental illness continued to get worse, to figure out, okay, I know I need help. Where is help? Is it doctors? Is it a crisis line? Where do I go? And there was just you look at I remember being in my university and staring at a Bristol board, and just so many things had some of the words of what I was feeling, but there was a lot of choice, and none of it really made sense, and I didn't know where to go, and it was overwhelmed, so I stopped. And then that was a long time of trying to figure out where to go. Then I tried a couple doors, and they all told me they were the wrong door. And then when I finally, and continuing getting worse every single day, I finally found the right door. The healthcare system seemed to think that was the beginning of my journey. And we are 4 to 5 years into this at this point. And then because they think it's the beginning of my journey, they think that they can pass me around and do a whole bunch of things and put me on wait lists, and they're not really helping. And they think that there's a whole other journey that I'll have energy for over here. And by the time I finally got into something that was working and I was seeing a difference, it was a difference of maybe 6 or 7 years. And I was lucky that when something finally did have space for me, that it was something that did work, and that's not everybody's experience. There are people I know who've tried 13, 14, 15 different therapy programs, medications, all of these different things. And I think for me to want to help people less choose MAiD, the minute you ask for help, that's when you should get it. It shouldn't be what's happening right now, because I know from youth that from folks that I've worked with, that the reason why someone ends up on the street or using medication is because they're fighting. They're using drugs they're fighting to keep themselves alive, because when they've asked for help, the help is simply not there. And I think if we're in a place where we want to see that MAiD for mental illness number get down to 0, the minute somebody asks for help, it should work. And I think we're, at least for young people and families in different parts of Canada, we are seeing a lot of success with the integrated youth service models of Foundry in British Columbia and the youth wellness hubs in Ontario, and I know Quebec has one. And we're seeing that when somebody shows up for help, that people are there and it's moving, and it's everybody you'd want to talk to around your mental illnesses in one building, which is another thing. There's like 7 different service providers you need. They're all at different parts of town, and you somehow have to figure out how to get to all of them. And like just having something that works. When you do the brave thing, it's always going to take work. It's always going to be hard. But when you do the brave thing, things should happen. You should get help. People should be there for you, and that's not the case right now.
That's not the case. Chris, what would you say you need to see?
Well, I work with a presupposition that life is sacred and precious, and we do all we can to preserve and help people, as much as we can, in terms of compassion. What I would like to end on is a comment about ending of life is an easier and cheaper solution than actually investing in healthcare and social supports. I mean, the solution, partly, in my view, is to go back to the drawing table and to reconsider how we expand medical assistance and dying law. Certainly to improve healthcare services, to invest in healthcare services, mental health care services, housing, social housing, adequate social supports. I never in my 71 years, as far as I can remember, ever said to anybody, "What's wrong with you?" Now, yeah, I probably did as a kid. What's the matter with you? The question we ought to be asking people with mental illnesses is, what has happened to you? And all the literature on social determinants of health, like housing, education, literacy, when you don't have social determinants of health, you will develop, to a certain degree, mental health challenges or mental illnesses. And everything is going to affect your chemistry. Some of you got a sore butt already listening to me. That's your chemistry saying you've had enough of me. I'm using a little humor here. So, you see my point here is that the government's preoccupation with this civil libertarian right thing, and it's not that I don't believe in them. I wouldn't be sitting here, for God's sakes, if it weren't for certain laws and regulations of allowing somebody like me to come to Canada. But the mental health system, how many people is going to send to hell?
I was trying to...
Or the lack of a mental health system.
At the beginning of our conversation, I was trying to get an understanding of what is considered a mental illness that would be eligible, someone would be eligible to receive MAiD. And the question is also circulating in the audience because we've talked a lot about depression. Earlier in the legislation, Alzheimer's was clearly identified as not to be included in MAiD. But now, as 2024 approaches, March approaches, what about conditions like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, or dementia, for example, and even addiction? How would those illnesses be addressed in this legislation?
Well, the legislation is pretty non-specific. It mentions mental illness. Yeah. Now, as a psychiatrist, mental illness is described in the DSM-5, which is the manual that we all use, and it covers a wide variety of conditions. The dementias are not included in this legislation for reasons that the policymakers have decided. The last time I looked, dementia was a psychiatric illness and was part of the human brain, but that is not covered in the the legislation at all. So it potentially is any condition. And if you look at, again, the experience in European countries is that people with a wide variety of diagnoses have been made eligible for MAiD. Now, the reason why the diagnosis is of not so much importance was illustrated by a case in Ontario, a woman named A.B. who applied for assisted death. The case went to court. Her condition was osteoarthritis, not a fatal illness at all. The judge ruled that it is not the diagnosis that's important. You have to look at the suffering of the individual person that's sitting in front of you. It's understanding the whole person and not the diagnosis that makes the person eligible for MAiD. So I think we're going to have to apply that for mental illness. It's not going to revolve around a particular diagnosis. It's going to be looking at the effect of the diagnosis on the person and has it interfere with their life. If you read the report from MAiD that just came out, the number one reason why the 13,000 Canadians have chosen MAiD is that they're no longer able to enjoy the usual activities that they engaged in. So this is not just about pain or suffering, it's about how it affects your entire life. And those are the decisions that doctors are going to have to wrestle with when this legislation comes into effect.
Go ahead, Dr. Gann.
So Dr. Smith is right. It's not something where the legislation would restrict it to any particular diagnoses. The one caveat is in terms of dementias, it's not that they're excluded. What the issue is that this current iteration of the law would not have what's called advanced directives. And what that means is that under our current law, the person, when they actually apply for MAiD, they need to have capacity.
Yeah.
They need to be competent. And the challenge with some dementias is that if you give consent, then once you lose capacity, how do you withdraw consent? And that's a really sticky thing to work out. But in terms of the diagnosis, so if you look at again, European countries, it's only Benelux countries like Belgium and Netherlands that allow MAiD for mental illness so far. But if you look at those, most are depression. MAiD for sole mental illness. It is still over 50% of people who apply have depression, but you see a smattering of things like personality disorder, you see grieving and bereavement, you see post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, there was a woman who had been victim of a terrorist attack. In response to the terrorist attack, she developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and she applied for MAiD there, and she got it.
Can you go back to grieving and bereavement? How is that a mental illness?
That was one of the, if you look at the reasons people in the Netherlands got it, that was one of the reasons. And again, keep in mind, 2-to-1 women to men getting it there. And the one thing that I would say is we're already starting to see a bit of a gender gap emerge in some areas, because the last report that came out, the third most common reason for MAiD was categorized as other, which is vague and non-specific. It had gone up from about 11, 12%. Oh, so you talked about the numbers earlier, 13,000. It's 4.1% of all Canadian deaths last year were by MAiD.
Yes.
In Quebec, 6.6%. In BC, 5.5%. And that vague other category, it includes all sorts of things when you go to other and what they call multiple comorbidities. So what that means is not cancer, not respirological, not neurologic, etc. And it does include things like hearing loss and all sorts of things. And in those categories, you see a gender gap. Between 30 to 60% more women than men get MAiD for those reasons. That should be concerning.
So in the report that was just released, has been referenced here by the two doctors tonight for this year, if I read it correctly, it said that the leading cause of why people ask for MAiD, cancer. Secondly, is not their life is not meaningful. Well, meaningfulness, and that's huge. Let me dare say, it's a spiritual question to find meaning in life. Spirituality, a sense of connection. And again, with loneliness, as he's talked about and so forth, we're going to see more and more people in our society feel like rimless bubbles on the sea of nothingness, which is an existential statement of meaninglessness. And there are people who say, I want out of life because it doesn't make any sense. It's meaningless. I fundamentally think it's a spiritual question.
I wonder, maybe Al, Dr. Smith, you could weigh in on this. When we think about already the pressures on our healthcare system, regardless of MAiD, and how the treatment of patients in any situation, in an emergency room, admitted to a floor for a while, we see more and more deterioration within the system and ultimately in terms of the care. I'm thinking of even situations that I know of when we're talking about dementia, where a patient has aphasia and perhaps signs of dementia. Hard to tell the difference because they're 85 years old. And the healthcare worker insists that they need this person, despite having a mandate, having a power of attorney, they need this person to agree and give consent to a decision. But then the question is, well, how can someone with aphasia or possible dementia give consent? Is there concern that with the pressure of the healthcare system, that eventually, and just how heavy all of this is in terms of understanding what can be permitted, what cannot, is there not concern that healthcare workers, after the doctor and people who are going to be processing, et cetera, might indirectly sway people's decision towards MAiD?
Well, to agree for any medical treatment, you have to have capacity. You have to be competent. That's true for getting operations or MAiD or anything else. So
Sure.
If people become incompetent, then they cannot agree to anything, and they have to have someone else make the decision on their behalf.
But is incompetent relative? Because if I can communicate and I can answer, how are you feeling today? I can answer, I feel good. But then I can't necessarily answer consistently that, yes, I would like to go to, for example, a long-term care facility for the rest of my life. How do we determine if the person really does have capacity? It's obvious if they can't speak, I understand, or if they can't hear, or they can't at all communicate a decision, but is it not relative?
Well, there are methods that psychiatrists in particular, but all doctors use to determine competency. So you just have to take my word that it can be determined whether a person is competent or not. In fact, for MAiD, the person must be competent, otherwise they're ineligible. So we can determine competency. That's not the issue. The difficulty is what to do with patients with any diagnosis who are not competent. Who is going to make decisions on their behalf? And that's the conundrum.
I think one of the things that the situations in which I endorse MAiD for folks with mental illness is when it's their idea. I do not want service providers in any way, shape, or form trying to push people in one or the other direction. And working every day with service providers, I know they're always going to push people for life. They're always going to push people for hope, because we've seen people come back the brink. And I mean, I'm an example of somebody who did not think they were going to be here and is here standing in front of you or sitting in front of you today. But I think the thing that has happened, and it's one of the things that I think Chris and so many mental health advocates before me have fought for, is that there are competent people with mental health issues. There are people who can sit in front of you and tell you, I am done. And it's not the depression speaking, it's not anything else speaking, it's coming to the rational decision that, like, I fought as hard as I could, I tried everything, and I'm done. And as hard as it is, and the peer supporter inside of me for the folks that I have lost, when I've had what I didn't know at the time was the last conversation with folks, I always wonder, like, what could I have said, what could I have done differently? But the thing is when I reflect on those conversations in a more sober mind, I'm like, they were telling me that everything has been done, they've checked everything, and I wish they had the opportunity to die with dignity for that choice. And for so long, people have spoken for folks with mental illness and made decisions for us and made us sound incapable. And the honest answer of it is, we're here, we have voices, and we have done amazing things, and so let us speak and listen.
That actually answers one of the questions that we had here from the audience. How can we ensure that individuals with mental illness provide informed and voluntary consent for medically assisted death? And it sounds to you that we have to trust what they say, that they are capable and can make the decision.
We have to really make sure that we're not like defaulting to a medical model that assumes that somebody else is going to have to speak for me, and that my thoughts and my opinions don't matter, because they do. And I think, as Dr. Smith was saying, we have ways of assessing it, but as the mental health system so frequently assumes that people with mental health issues are not competent, and that's not the case. Remember, I disclosed that I had one of my diagnoses to a service provider, and at that time they stopped talking to me and started talking to my partner. And so, we have voices. I mean, if I was incompetent, then how am I able to accomplish everything I've been able to accomplish today? So I not everybody with a mental health issue is, and we have systems to address that. But when folks are explaining their pain and they're competent, they have a voice that should be listened to.
Dr. Gann, you want to add something?
Just a couple of brief points. And I think that the reality is that when people have mental illness, vast majority of the time, people are competent. It's not that the mental illness takes away people's competence or capacity. One of the things it does do, especially things like depression, is it changes how we think, even while we are competent. And anyone who's had depression knows that. When we have depression, we've got this worldview that I am bad. So basically, I remember one of my colleagues in residency saying, remember the cognitive triad. It is that I suck, the world sucks, and the future will suck. And that is actually what depression tells us, and then we think differently. But most people are competent. But Al's made an important point a couple of times here, which is that when these discussions come up, it is something that should be brought up by the person, not by the white lab coat. And every other country actually requires that. Here, the push is to actually have this become a quote-unquote informed choice that the medical system is telling everyone they could be eligible for if they're eligible, which is very different. It does then potentially sway people's opinions. There was a recent case of a woman who, in distress, went to a Vancouver hospital. And she's previously been suicidal. She had depression, and she met with a counselor in the hospital. The counselor connected with her. She felt empathically connected with the counselor. And then the counselor asked, "Have you considered MAiD?" And she was shocked. And the counselor went on to then actually say something along the lines of how comfortable the process was in relieving suffering of some of the people she had seen get it. And this person, she went to the media to report this. There was the case that people know of the person in the military who, when they wanted a wheelchair ramp that they hadn't been able to get, well, have you thought about MAiD? Things like that. Our laws allow that. The Regional Health Authority in Vancouver in BC defended that. And so these are things where they have an impact, and I don't see how that doesn't come across as a suggestion coming from a white lab coat.
Well, let me comment on the situation in BC, which I know. This person who asked that question was incompetent. The person who suggested to a member of the military they should have MAiD is incompetent. That does not detract from the power of this law. It just means that we need better training. No one should ever be offered MAiD, particularly a young person who has never had to go at treatment. MAiD should always be generated by the individual speaking to their doctor and should not be part of a routine mental health assessment. That clearly is just should not be allowed.
So you're speaking to accountability. How, and training, but therefore, what would be the last phase of accountability when looking at someone's file who's asked for MAiD because they cannot continue to live and their mental illness is just making their quality of life so horrible? What would be that final stage of accountability?
Well, the final stage of accountability is when the physicians who's administering MAiD asks the person once again, are you sure that you want to proceed with this? And only after that can the doctor administer MAiD to that individual. So it comes down to the very minute before the person gets a lethal injection from their doctor. Another level of accountability is that if doctors are not following the law, if they're giving out MAiD to people who don't deserve it, they could be criminally charged. Remember, these MAiD laws are not health legislation, they're an amendment to the criminal code.
But isn't that after the fact?
That's after the fact, but the fact that there's not been a single doctor over the last 5 years charged with anything around MAiD suggests to me that doctors are acting in the best interests of the patient and they're acting within the confines of the law.
Dr. Gann, you want to respond?
I would say there have been significant concerns in many cases. In fact, there are families who've taken cases to police, and it is true what Dr. Smith is saying, that no one's actually been charged, but all of the data that's reported on this is self-reported by the assessors themselves. They're fully aware, as I would be, that if something goes on there that's incorrect, I could be criminally liable and charged, etc. And so we need to keep that in mind. And also, in terms of changing minds and the final accountability piece, in the original law, there was what was called a 10-day reflection period. And so when somebody applied for MAiD, they had to wait at least 10 days before they were provided it. In my hospital, when I worked as the chair of our MAiD team, we had some people change their minds during that 10 days. And it wasn't because their medical conditions got better, it's because they reconnected with family. It's because something in their social circumstances actually got better. And they changed their minds. Now, in the last iteration in C7, they eliminated the 10-day reflection period for anyone whose death might be foreseeable in the next 10 years. So there's no necessary waiting period at all. You can get MAiD the next day. You could conceivably get it the same day. What we've seen in terms of the number of people who actually changed their minds, that has also gone down, no surprise. About 4 years ago, I think it was about maybe 4% or something changed their minds. Now it's less than 2%, but there's also no waiting period or reflection period. And in terms of providers not approving for MAiD, very few cases of MAiD applications end up not being approved, and that number is also going down. I think about 4 years ago, it was about 7 or 8% that were not approved, and now it's about 3.5% who are not approved. And so people can read into that what they think. That
there is a reflection period for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, and it's 90 days. So there is plenty of time for people to reflect. People whose death is not imminent, people who are disabled, people who have mental illness have 90 days to reflect upon whether they get MAiD or not. So there is a reflection period built into the legislation, and that's an important safeguard because people do change their mind.
Speaking about time, I do want to get to a question regarding safeguards and enough time for the provinces to develop their legislation and their procedures by 2024. But before that, because Dr. Gann was also talking about family, and we have some questions regarding family, and Chris, you spoke a lot about if a family member or a friend came to you and said that they want to have MAiD, that you would pray with them and that you would find ways to support them. So I'll put the question to you first. What can families do when it comes to having a relative who has a mental illness and who would like to apply for MAiD?
Well, these are heavy questions indeed. Don't see an illness, see the person. So if your daughter or son has a mental illness, don't fixate on the mental illness, but on that person and what are their strengths and what's their hopes and their dreams, and to help them fulfill that, and whatever medical assistance they need, and our psychotherapy, etc. If you can afford it, then get it. If you don't live too far rurally or something like that, and then teach your children the sacredness of life, that life is sacred, and how we treat each other with love and compassion and hope. And learning to journey alongside of. In the New Testament, when it speaks of the Holy Spirit as a paraclete, That Greek word paraclete in the old Greek language means a person who comes alongside of you and helps you carry your bed. So when people would travel, and they traveled by walking in those days, in the biblical times, and they would come alongside a person and help them carry their bed. Developing meaningful relationships. Do you have a relationship? A meaningful relationship that you could ask any question to your child or your husband and wife. The things that offset loneliness, building network communities. I mean, healing takes place in community. It's not isolation. Recovery is not in isolation. People have powerful stories of what helped them to get better, and it's never a Lone Ranger sort of story. It's about even hearing my sister, she talked about her battle with cancer in the last number of years. You know, the community that was around her. It's such a complex, question. And, I think some of the things that I've said, and hope changes everything. It's fundamental. You can hardly live without hope. And people take their lives, as my father did, because he didn't have hope in the guilt that he struggled with. Life is complicated. I mean, look at us here tonight. We got it easy. I mean, we can go down into sections of this city, and we wouldn't even survive 2 minutes because of the great losses, self-imposed or imposed by society, that people have on them.
I think, Al, you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things, and this is a related story, but one of the things that happened to me when I was diagnosed with cancer and we weren't sure of my prognosis was a lot of folks wanted me to support them about the fact that I might die. Mm-hmm. And I think people do that when they're panicking and they don't realize it. So if you have a loved one who's considering MAiD, my first thing would be get somebody who's a support person to you outside of that person. Talk to a therapist, find another friend. You're going to comfort in and you're going to ask for support out further away from that person. I think you can ask the hard questions, but I would also come in with an understanding that that there's pain and suffering and oftentimes options that ended up with somebody where they're considering this, and those things are real. But I'd really rely on some other folks outside of that to support you and work through your feelings about it. So you're being able to go there and support them. And it is normal to struggle with it. It's normal to be scared. It's normal to be sad. You're going to be missing your person. But for me, when I supported my friend through making that decision and ultimately ultimately ending his life, that having that support outside of it, having someone out a little further removed to process that feeling made a difference. But and the one thing that I will say is that knowing for me and when they were no longer here and supporting them, knowing that they were gone, it wasn't a surprise, and having that support built in for it was very different than how I've processed the suicides we didn't know were coming, the calls that we got, the folks in my life and myself who found people who died by suicide. So it is if we can't prevent it, it's a vastly different experience. And yeah.
4 months until March 24th. And the idea is to give provinces and territories time to finalize, establish, create their safeguards. We have a question. We were planning to ask this question. Is there enough time to do that properly and well and clearly without mistakes?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and I think you have to go back to when MAiD first became legal in Canada. We had no infrastructure at all. Canadian doctors answered the challenge and put in place a training structure for doctors who were involved with MAiD. The organization that Sanu mentioned, CANAP, has been working at this for more than a year. They have a complete training module for doctors who are going to be assessing patients for MAiD, patients with mental illness. Doctors across Canada are receiving this training. I went to the Psychiatric Association meeting last week in Vancouver, and there were training modules for doctors about how to assess patients who apply for MAiD with mental illness. So the answer is the doctors of Canada are ready for this. Whether the provinces are is a different question. This, after all, is federal legislation, but the delivery of health care is provincial. So it's one of the conundrums of Canada is that we have two competing jurisdictions. But I see no reason why the provinces would not be able to respond, because there's going to be a very small number of people applying and eligible for MAiD for mental illness.
But there isn't a large number of medical professionals who actually feel comfortable with this legislation.
Well, that's not true. There's enough psychiatrists in this country to assess all the people who apply for MAiD.
There are enough of them, but there aren't maybe enough of them who feel comfortable making that decision.
Well, I'm talking about the people who have received the training in Vancouver and can get this training online. There'll be no shortage of psychiatrists able and willing to assess people for MAiD. Doesn't mean that everyone has to do it. In fact, everybody will not want to do it, but there are enough numbers of psychiatrists to do this.
Yeah, I think there is training that's taking place. My daughter's a chaplain at Bethesda Hospital in Steinbeck, Manitoba, where we live, and she's pretty well versed on this, because many people will ask for a spiritual health care director or a chaplain when they're considering this, and it's just surprised me how much she has learned in terms of what he has just said, about the training that is going on.
Mm-hmm. Pretty well versed, however, Chris, does raise some anxiety. We want people to be certain about the information, I gather. Yeah,
so
Dr.
I have a different view. I would say the answer is absolutely no.
We do not have enough time.
It's not only do we not have enough time, we don't know what we're going to be doing. Having manualized training, standardized training that people get, it doesn't mean that you're doing what you should be doing. It doesn't mean you know what you're doing. It just means that you've got some things that have been manualized and trained. And the expert panel that looked at this, it's remarkable. And this is from actually some of the same people who were involved in pushing MAiD expansion for a long time, but it's quite remarkable. The expert panel on MAiD and mental illness, they were charged with coming back with safeguards, guidelines, and protocols. They came back and they literally said no additional legislative safeguards are required. So they refused to introduce any more legislative safeguards. On the very tricky topic of how do you predict irremediability? How do you predict when a mental illness won't improve? I mean, the evidence already tells us that we can't do it in any meaningful way. But even if we're trying to pretend that we can, how would we do it? They came back and they said, we cannot provide guidance on the lengths, numbers, or types of treatments that should be tried before providing MAiD for mental illness. They came back and they essentially said that even if MAiD and suicide are the same thing, we're going to go ahead and provide it. They said that even if MAiD and suicide are not distinct entities, society has made a choice to provide MAiD anyways. I don't know. I haven't made that choice. I don't think our society has made that choice. I don't know if people in the room have made that choice. You have to reflect on that yourselves. And by a 2-to-1 ratio, any of the things that look at this tell that psychiatrists, most psychiatrists support MAiD. 80 to 90% support MAiD in general. But by 2-to-1 ratio, any of the reasonable studies that look at this or surveys show that by 2-to-1 ratio, psychiatrists do not support expanding MAiD for sole mental illness. So we are not ready. And if we have a small handful of people who are providing MAiD because they can, is that a good thing?
Language is so delicate here because Dr. Smith was saying it's not an expansion, it's that we are actually applying what was already written into the law before. You have used the term expanding, and there are questions in the audience still whether will this legislation actually come into effect in 2024? Dr. Smith, you say, yes, it will, because it is at royal assent, and
Well,
it will happen unless what?
On paper, it will, but on paper, it was going to come in last year as well.
Right.
The reason it was delayed for a year is because this got put into what I call big P politics, liberals versus conservatives, and there was such uncertainty in the House of Commons that they delayed it for a year. So I'm hopeful that it won't be delayed again, but anything can happen
And you don't
in
think
the world of politics. A recent bill from a conservative member of parliament to forbid MAiD for psychiatric illness was defeated, which in my view is a good thing. So I'm hopeful that it will come in March, but anything could happen.
However, Dr. Smith, you don't think that that sort of political divide is actually coming from Canadians? I mean, if you go to Dying with Dignity's website, they are actively telling people, go and petition to your MP to support this, et cetera, et cetera. I would imagine on the reverse side, the same thing is happening for people who don't want it to happen. So do you really think it's about politicians making these choices, or are politicians not listening to their constituents?
Well, the major decisions around MAiD in Canada have not been made by politicians. They've been made by the courts. And the politicians have shown no leadership. They're only reactive and reluctantly reactive to decisions that come down from the courts. So I'm comfortable that if these issues become of a controversial nature, they will be back in court. And I'm perfectly prepared to argue the arguments that the positions we've had here. Mm-hmm. When Dr. Gain and I don't agree on something, there is a way to adjudicate that, and that's before a justice, ultimately before the Supreme Court of Canada. So I would welcome more rather than less input from the judges. It is a political thing because the bills have been passed by politicians, and all of us as citizens have the right to call up our members of parliament and tell them what we would like to see happen. So I would encourage all the members of the audience to do that if they feel strongly about this.
I think on this issue, members of parliament are somewhat listening to the communities, and that's why it's so controversial, and has been for the last year. There's not even unanimity within the mental health community. Mm-hmm. If you talk about nonprofits like ours and AMI-Quebec, and so we tread carefully when there's not unanimity. Mm-hmm.
You want to add? And I'll give Al the final word.
Oh, pressure. I will say, I think the honest answer of this is that the lived experience advocacy community is split. It is a lot of folks who are worried that that people are going to come up to them and start suggesting MAiD rather than continuing to invest in treatments that will make them have a life worth living. And there's also folks who are frustrated with the lack of options to die with dignity because the treatments are not working and they're tired. And for me, I don't know, when you're asking if you're going to be ready, this is such a huge change. I don't know if you'll ever be 100% ready. And I think it's one of those things where, but every day that we aren't doing this, there are people, there are very large advocates, very big folks who are dying by suicide, and they're not getting that option to die with dignity, and they are getting the option and they can't live anymore, but they also know the harm that this is going to happen to the community around them, and it's very complicated and hard. The community is split. I think at the end of the day, I want folks to be able to have the option, but I also want folks to have the option of hope and not feel like because of the resources in their community, because of because nobody is listening to them, that this is what they have to choose. But it's something that is going to be super complex, and opinions are going to evolve. And it's I'm somebody who stands in front of you today because quite literally when I was in the throes of mental illness and I was in a hospital ward, the thing that changed my mind was not any of the lovely doctors and nurses who were there. It was another patient who gave me a necklace with the word hope on it. And that was the thing that took me out of there and helped me make a different path for myself. But I respect my friends and I respect my colleagues who have tried everything, talked to everybody, and nothing's working, and I think we need to listen to them.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists so much for all of the information shared this evening. Al Raimundo, Chris Somerville, Dr. Sonu Gand, Dr. Derek Smith. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. We alerted you to the complexity of this subject matter, and you certainly delivered. So if you're coming away more confused than you came in, this is probably part of the deal. And it's not a coincidence that AMI-Quebec has refrained from making a statement in that respect, and we will just leave it up to you to make your own decisions. So thank you again very much, Nantali, Al, Chris, Dr. Gand, and Dr. Smith, and see you next time.